I'm going to talk about tonsils because I can remember very clearly having my own tonsils out, and I'll talk to you later about your experiences of this, and include Sandy's recollection. She couldn't make it, but she sent me her recollections of having tonsils out as well.
I still got mine.
I'm impressed you've still got them, and good for you. It started out because a friend of mine said he'd got tonsillitis. And of course, when you've got tonsillitis and it's kind of a bacterial or a viral one, it can be quite serious when you're older, because having a tonsillectomy when you're older is much, much more difficult than when you're very young. Nearly all tonsillectomies, that is getting rid of your tonsils, happens to young children, basically under the age of 10, because it seems to cause less trauma when that happens. Though I found the whole thing pretty traumatic when it happened to me. Anyway, apparently it's one of the oldest operations known in history, and it goes back to ancient Hindu writings, about 1000 BC. And in ancient Hindu writings, it was a partial tonsillectomy, involved using fingernails for dissection and skilled healers dentally removing tonsils with their own hands, which must have been quite difficult. And anyway, tonsillectomy really became in its modern form under somebody called George Ernest Waugh, the father of modern tonsillectomy. He was born in a small village near Oxford and worked as a surgeon at the Great Ormond Street Paediatric Hospital, which is still there, very famous hospital. And his method involved what was called subcapsular blunt dissection. Apparently, it involves gently separating the tonsil from its surrounding tissue without cutting it or cutting it too much. Apparently, he reported no complications in his methodology in over 700 patients who underwent the technique, and improved patient outcomes and safety during a tonsillectomy. And it's still, variations of that particular technique are used today. It's sometimes called the cold metal approach, or the tonsillar dissector, which is a thin, long instrument you can see there on top, that's used to separate the tonsil from its bed in this particular method, with one end flattened out like a blade and the other end is serrated. And basically, there are two techniques in amputating: the cold steel one, and the other, the guillotine methodology, which involves a crushing blade, and it acts a bit in the same way as guillotine, though it's not like you imagine a guillotine is, obviously, but they don't seem to mind about using terms like that scare you to death. Somebody called Otto Oswald Popper developed it in the 1920s, but both techniques are used to this day. When it removes a tonsil, the surgeon performs hemostasis, which is stopping bleeding. This is achieved by adding a segregation on the bleeding vessels. Then it ties off the blood vessels to prevent further bleeding, and it's aimed to minimize trauma. Now, onto the tonsil riots, which I imagine, I'd be surprised if any of you have heard them before. I'd never heard of them.
No, I haven't heard of it.
And it's an extraordinary story, really. But if you look at the newspaper cutting from 1906, New York, it was in New York. And the cutting, if you scan through it, is very kind of, patronizing in some ways. As the little ones marched out, the scenes were pathetic. Weeping women rushing forward to clasp their children to their arms in thanksgiving. Throughout the disorders, several hundred extra patrolmen on duty were powerless to restore order. These are some of the pictures at the time. But it was based around the idea that children's throats were being cut in the public schools, that many of the local Jewish community, it was a very heavily populated, very poor area of New York at the time. And it was several of the public schools had asked for parental consent to have Board of Health physicians come and perform tonsillectomies and adenoidectomies on their students. Well, this is how it was told. Children were subsequently returned home from school, and their parents hadn't really known, because sometimes the children just signed them themselves because they thought they were getting a half day off school. And at other times, the parents signed them. They were in English, and most of them spoke and wrote Yiddish, so they weren't able to understand them anyway. But they returned home from school, drooling mouthfuls of blood and barely able to speak. The mothers reacted with panic and flocked to the schools, demanding the safe return of their children. Sometimes called the adenoid riots because most of them were operations on the adenoids. And the picture on the right, taken from 1911, a child with the typical face of a mouth breather from adenoids. That is, the adenoids were stopping them being able to breathe through their nose. And that was the indication that any child having anything like that, give them a tonsillectomy or an adenoid operation.
You have to look at it in context. The people, the Jewish community, were largely coming over from Eastern Europe, where they'd been subject many times to pogroms, where especially at Easter, men would get drunk and just run amok and did cut throats and commit all sorts of horrible crimes.
No, I agree. And I'm actually coming on to that because it sounds like it's a fairly hysterical reaction. But as you say, there's really quite a context of the whole thing. Well, this is where the adenoid is. And they felt that mouth breathing would lead to less brain oxygenation and feeble-mindedness, which had no medical reason for concluding that at all. So these were some of the illustrations that were in the local papers. And apparently the comments got wilder and wilder as people were hearing about this, and it's related to the pogrom issue. So that beforehand as well, some of the Jewish doctors had gone around from door to door saying that this is what they were doing in the schools. They were going to cut throats. So they had a kind of an orientation towards that. But it actually came out on the heels of a particularly brutal pogrom in Białystok, I think it was in Poland, that had been reported, including gruesome photos by the Yiddish press a few weeks earlier. Accustomed to such violence in Europe, many of the recent arrivals believed such things could happen even in America. Though I think part of the interest here is that they were also aware that whereas if they'd done this in Poland, they'd have likely to have been shot. In America, they weren't. It was they did learn that there was something different going on there. But the riots in themselves, you could understand exactly why this was going on. But I thought it was interesting because I just never heard of it. And also interestingly, later riots were in other districts and included some of the Italian community as well, who were also concerned about it. Coming on to the tonsils in more modern times, in the 20th century, it was routinely performed on at least 80,000 school children every year in Britain. It was the most common operation on children. Though by the end of the 1970s, opinion turned both in the general public's view and also in the medical profession's view as a bit of a dangerous fad. And it says that it's supposed to be exceptional. It's almost exclusively performance on children and became a medical ritual that 20th century children passed through to access a normal childhood, having your tonsils out. Another interesting sideline, which I'd never heard of either, was something called polio provocation. It's the idea that there was a health risk facing unvaccinated children in polio epidemic regions. A study of more than 2,000 case histories in the 1940s concluded that tonsillectomies led to a significant risk of respiratory paralysis due to bulbar polio. It certainly couldn't have affected me because I got polio when I was a baby. I had my tonsillectomy after I'd had polio rather than before, but this is what they found out. Now, with the introduction of the Salk vaccine and the Sabin vaccine in the 50s and 60s, it meant that polio prevention became really effective. But there were epidemics in India during the 1990s. And a study there found that injections seem to have a role in causing paralytic polio. It was in 1998, that there was a study of the tissue injury produced by injections, that it actually was aiding the polio virus to infect the body and readily journey to the spinal cord. So it wasn't absolutely without foundation that it became less important as antibiotics and vaccinations meant that there was less polio around. Tonsillectomies over time. It became over 200,000 tonsillectomy performed annually at one point. And in the early years of this century, there was a cohort study which analysed the medical records of UK children aged 0 to 15. And they found out that evidence-based tonsillectomies, less than 12% had evidence-based indications using what are known as another strange term, the Paradise criteria. So they estimated 32,500 of the 37,000 children tonsillectomies in 2016 and 17 were unnecessary, costing the NHS approximately £36.9 million. So they're still going on today. The tonsillectomy Paradise criteria is that you should have at least 7 sore throat episodes in the previous year, temperatures greater than 109.9 degrees Fahrenheit during a sore throat episode, or a positive culture for a streptococcus infection. The reality of sore throats is that the vast majorities just cure themselves. Children are, I know from my own grandchildren, that they often do seem to have sore throats and coughing that goes with it, but then it goes. Whereas if you had it a couple of times or so in the 50s, or even if you didn't have anything, you were likely to be sent off for your tonsillectomy. And this is a quote from Sandy. I had my tonsils out when I was 10, and I still remember the agony of the cornflakes the hospital made us eat for breakfast after the op. I mean, it's small things like that that can have big influences. Research suggests children with fewer sore throats don't justify surgery because they tend to go away anyway. And even though complications are rare, they can be severe, including severe bleeding. Latest figures seem to show around about 50,000 tonsillectomies. I'm not absolutely sure on that figure for 2020, but that's what I think I've found. There are still a lot going on. And now on to something a little bit different. My own image of having a tonsillectomy, which I can remember very clearly, was of being wheeled along in a corridor, taken to the surgery, and a nurse put her hand on my forehead. And I felt all the anxiety drain out of my head, and it left me with a strong impression of how a simple touch can have such a drastic effect on you. It was like electric going through me, sort of just relaxing me. So I asked DAL E3, generate an image of a young boy being wheeled along a hospital corridor in 1950s UK to an operating theatre to have his tonsils removed. The nurse beside him puts her hand on his forehead. And that's one of the ones that it came up with, which I thought were good.
I'm not sure my waist was as small as that, Bernard.
I'm sure it was, Lorraine. I'm sure it was. These are Dali ones too. These are different variations on it. I gave a black and white one. There are all sorts of variations. Those are 2 more. One on the right looks a bit American, doesn't it? Now, something else I'm going to show you. It's just a 1-minute clip of a film, a 1930s film that I found of Mr. George War's method of tonsillectomy.
Oh dear.
Terrifying, really, for a child.
That's the guillotine.
Do you
Yeah.
remember they used to give you those bits in little pots?
I forgot
Did
about tonsil stones. Have you heard about tonsil stones?
No.
It actually has little concave bits in it, and bits of food, biological material, can gather it, and it gradually hardens into a stone, which can be up to the size of a grape. And they have to be removed as well. Apparently, it used to cause extremely bad breath when you had one.
Most entertaining, Bernard. Most
Yes,
entertaining.
yeah, it was. It was
Yes.
interesting.
I,
We
I,
need a trigger warning in future.
How many of the people here have had their tonsils out?
I was 20.
Oh gosh.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a really bad
That is
session
old,
of
yeah.
glandular fever.